It is my great pleasure and honor to invite an outstanding scholar, one of the world's leading professionals in the field, a masterful clinician, and most importantly, a very special human being who has a mensch who has touched us all during his stay, Professor Kenneth Pargament, who will give the keynote address of this conference. I want to say just a few words. This person has done a lot. Kenneth Pargament is a professor emeritus of psychology at Bowling State University, an adjunct professor in the Menninger Department of Psychiatry at Baylor Medical School. He has served as distinguished scholar at the Institute of Spirituality and Health in Houston. He has published over 300 articles on religion, spirituality, and health, and authored The Psychology of Religion and Coping, Theory, Research, Practice, and Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy, Understanding and Addressing the Sacred. Dr. Pargament is editor-in-chief of the 2013 two-volume APA Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality. Among his awards are the Oscar Fraser Award from the American Psychiatric Association in 2009, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Ohio Psychological Association in 2010, the Distinguished Service Award from the Association of Professional Chaplains in 2015, and the first Applied Psychology of Religion and Spirituality Award from Division 36 of the American Psychological Association. He received an honorary Doctor of Letters from Pepperdine University. He was recently cited as one of the 50 most influential living psychologists in the world today. Can I get an applause? And of course, last but not least, Dr. Pargament has been married 43 years to his wife, Eileen, who is here with us too. He has two children, two daughters-in-law, and two new granddaughters. Thank you, Professor Pargament, for being here with us.
Thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor to be here, and I have to say, I am so moved by the introductions that have preceded me. I don't think I've ever had such beautiful introductions here in the music, and I feel like if we stop now, it would be sufficient. Dayenu. It would be good. I am honored to be here. This is a pioneering moment, I think a critical turning point in the field. It's and more than that, it's, for me at least, a simcha. It's something that is really moves me and touches me to see this coming together of people and ideas into one group, one movement. I would like to thank those who brought me here, the organizing committee, and most of all, Panini Russo-Netzer and Ofer Mazlis. They are, for their leadership and for their vision, and they are also the most wonderful hosts I've ever been fortunate to have. I came here and every minute has been, they've wrapped me in caring and total security and comfort and constant food. I don't think I've ever eaten so much, and when my wife Aileen came here too, I told her how much we're eating and she couldn't believe it. And then we went out to lunch yesterday and she said, I can't believe this. I'd also like to thank some other people. These are some of my colleagues and collaborators over the years. This kind of work is too rich and complicated and too hard to do by yourself. It has to be done in collaboration, in community, with connection, the kind that we have here, the kind of center that Ofer is developing here now, is too complex to do on our own. We need to work together. And I've been so fortunate to have wonderful graduate students and wonderful colleagues and faculty all over the United States and really all over the world, and these are just a few of them. I also want to give my special thanks, because this is a really special time for me to have my family from Israel here. It's people I haven't seen for some years now. And I'm so grateful for them to be here, and my wife, who came to Israel with me here to support me and to travel with me. And so my special love to Aileen, as always. And there's one more group I want to acknowledge, two people from my family who aren't here. I always said I would never be the kind of grandfather who would dote on his grandchildren. And this is what I said to myself. And so much for that. On the left is Emmy. She's our 1-year-old granddaughter. And on the right is Oliver, our 5-month-old, in this picture, grandson, who's wearing pants for the first time. He looks a little bit more mature wearing pants, but so much for my commitment not to dote on my grandchildren. This conference is a real, I think, mark of incredible changes that have taken place in the last 40 years. Let me tell you a story about my first presentation that contrasts with where we are now. I was giving my first job talk at a university about religion and mental health. We called it religion back then. We didn't have the spiritual word. That wasn't very popular. And it went okay, the talk, and afterwards the chairman of the department, a very distinguished man, comes up, right standing in front of me over the podium, and he says, "I enjoyed your talk." So I kind of leaned over and said, "Thank you." He then said, "I'm Catholic." Unfortunately, I'd been trained in clinical psychology, so I know how to respond to every situation. So I leaned over back and I said, "Oh." Oh is a very good response whenever you don't know what to do. Oh. Then I said, "Why are we whispering?" And he was a little embarrassed, and he said, "Well, you were talking about religion. It's not something we talk about in psychology." Well, that was a mark of the times. At that time, he was correct. We did not talk about religion openly. It was a taboo topic, something that wasn't discussed openly. Well, things have changed, and I'm not whispering. We have singing. We have people with voices, people in important positions talking out loud. They used the R word. They used the S word. We can talk about it without trying to hide it. And that's what this conference is about, talking about religion, spirituality more explicitly and integrating it into our education, into our therapy, into the way we deal with each other in our lives. Let me introduce this talk by sharing a story about a client that I worked with a number of years ago that really affected my own career. This is the story of Alice. Now, this isn't really Alice. I looked online for a picture of a woman who had the spirit of Alice. And this is what I found. This is Alice. She had the twinkle in her eye, and she was a real character. She had come to me in her mid-40s because she'd been dealing with bipolar illness for her entire life. Her life had been a series of terrible mood swings. She had been hospitalized initially at the age of 13, and since that time had been hospitalized probably twice a year on average for the last 30 years. She had been unsuccessful in finding any stability in her moods, and her moods would range from the darkest depression to periods when she could function fairly well, though she could never have a family, she could never keep a job, and always led a somewhat marginal existence. She came to see me after having seen many, many other therapists and psychiatrists, and I worked with her for a year, and I was no more successful than anyone else. She was hospitalized a few times during the year, feeling suicidal, and one day she comes into the office, crying hysterically, saying she wants to die. And when I talked with her about it, she had a plan. She was going to go into the garage and turn her car on and asphyxiate herself. So inside I'm thinking, I'm feeling so terrible for Alice. She's such a really wonderful woman. She's a really sweet, caring. She worked with therapy dogs. She would take her dogs to hospice, to palliative care centers, and everyone loved Alice. But I thought, I've got to get her to the hospital. I'm of no help to her. And at one point, in the middle of her crying, she cries out, "Oh, when will my suffering end? Oh, when will my suffering end?" And that was different language for Alice. It sounded almost biblical, a lamentation. And she was never talked about religion or spirituality. But when she said, "Oh, when will my suffering end?" I felt like I needed to respond somewhat similarly. So I ended up saying, "Alice, where do you turn to for solace in the midst of your suffering?" Now, I'm not usually the kind of person who talks a lot about solace. I'm not a solace kind of guy. But the language was, she took me quite seriously, and she stopped. And she said, "Well, I've never said this to anyone before, but when I was first hospitalized, they put me in the room with restraints, and I thought I was going to die. And I'm there crying and crying and crying. And then I felt a warmth in the center of my chest, and it began to spread through my body. And then it spoke to me." I said, what did the voice say?" She said, "The voice said, 'I'm with you, I will always be with you.'" "Alice, who was talking to you?" She said, "Oh, that was God. God was telling me that even when I'm at my worst moments in life, God would always be with me." I said, "Oh my gosh, have you had that experience since?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I have it sometimes when I'm at my lowest." So we start talking about her spiritual experience. That took up most of the rest of the session. And as we talked about it, she had stopped crying. She was no longer hysterical. And towards the end of the session, I asked her, "Alice, you seem to be calmer, and you're feeling better. Are you still feeling like you're going to hurt yourself?" She says, "No, I don't think so. I think I'm okay. I don't think I'll hurt myself." And she signed the contract that we had not to hurt herself. And as she was leaving, I said to her, I stopped her, I said, "Alice, you said something to me that was really striking. You said, you've never talked about this experience with anyone before." Now, Alice was a mental health veteran, 30 years of treatment. She'd never mentioned this experience. I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, they already think I'm crazy." Well, Alice was certainly diagnosable, but in this respect, she was not crazy. She was quite accurate in her understanding of the mental health profession, that spiritual experience was equated with mental illness. She was quite sensitive to the fact that mental health professionals, when it comes to religion and spirituality, we have issues. We have issues that haven't been resolved. In this talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about why integrating the spiritual dimension into our work is challenging. And then I'd like to offer an empirically based rationale, an evidence-based rationale for why doing the kind of work that you are doing, why it makes such good sense from a research point of view. Let's talk a little bit about the tension in the field. There's a long history of tension between religion and psychology and counseling. Freud was not a huge fan of religion. As he said, religion works by distorting the picture of the real world in delusional manner, by forcibly fixing adherents in a state of psychical infantilism and drawing them into a mass delusion. This is pretty critical talk about religious life that's continued to have its effects in mental health in the form of other well-known psychologists, such as B.F. Skinner, Albert Ellis, and so on. How do we explain this tension? Well, I think one explanation is that as psychology became more of a science, there was a strong effort to avoid anything that hinted of superstition or magic or religion. Psychology was trying to establish itself as another hard science. Another explanation is that mental health professionals, we're abnormal. I don't mean to be insulting, I mean abnormal in the statistical sense. That statistically, we are unrepresentative of the people that we see in our therapy and in our professional lives. This was a survey done in 2013 or so that looked at the question, do you agree that religion is very important or fairly important? Now in the US, in the general population, 90% agree. When we look at the same question and response among psychologists, particularly clinical psychologists, you can guess what the percentage is. 23%. We are abnormal. Believing in God. In the United States, at least, if we ask that question, 96% of the general population, it can vary from 90 to 96% in the United States. What happens when we ask clinical psychologists? .24%. This is what's been called the spirituality or the religiosity gap, that as a field, mental health professionals tend to be very different than the people that we see and serve, and so we may tend to underestimate the prevalence and power of spirituality in people's lives. I don't have comparable figures from Israel, but I'd be very interested in what they might look like here and how different they might be. Another explanation for the tension between spirituality and counseling is the fact that they, in some respects, can represent different value systems. Different value systems. In psychology and science, we have the emphasis on empiricism. In spirituality, we have an emphasis on inner authority. Answers don't come from data. Answers come from our sense of things, how we feel. In psychology, we tend to be pretty individualistic. In spirituality, there's a lot of talk about interconnectedness. We heard this morning Professor Alexander talking about common humanity, connections. In psychology, science, we talk about skepticism. In spirituality, we talk about mystery and faith. I feel like I'm George Carlin, if you remember him, going through the different languages back and forth. In psychology, we talk about emphasizing mastery and control. And that's what we do in therapy, helping people gain greater mastery and control when they often feel terribly out of control. In spirituality, we often talk about acceptance of human limitations, acceptance of our frailty and our mortality. In psychology, we take in medicine, we are very specialized programs. In spirituality, we talk more about wholeness. And in psychology, we tend to still be, to a great extent, very focused on psychopathology. In spirituality, we talk about flourishing. And there is, these are important differences, and in some respects, maybe different language systems. Now, this is, of course, a polarization that doesn't really hold up very well. And in fact, there's room for bridging these perspectives. And that's very much what a holistic approach to to helping people involves bridging the psychological with the spiritual, bridging science and religion, connecting what may seem to be disintegrated. And we are seeing changes. I came across, I actually put this together a while back, look at the numbers of articles that contain the words religion and spirituality over the last probably, now it's getting close to 50 years. You can see just dramatic increase in the number of articles with religion, but especially with spirituality, from 5 to 7,000, over 7,000. So there's a shift, and this conference is, I think, a testament to that shift. And I think a shift here in Israel I've been so excited to see, thanks to the pioneering contributions of people like Ofer and Paninit and other wonderful psychologists in Israel. You have people like Ariel Lazar and one of my former graduate students here, Hisham Abu Raya, and other wonderful psychologists doing this kind of integration. But maybe the simplest explanation for the tension between spirituality and efforts to help people through psychology and counseling is the fact that we just don't know how to do it. A lack of training. In the US and Canada, only 1/4 of PhD programs offer any kind of course in psychology and spirituality. There's just no training. And I think as a result, when mental health professionals encounter spiritual issues in counseling, they don't know what to do. And they may change the subject to something that's more comfortable. So if a client mentions God, then the therapist may say, well, it kind of reminds me of the way you talk about your father. So the focus changes. Or maybe the therapists try to just be neutral when it comes to religion and spirituality and leave all of that at the door to be blank slates, which we know actually, studies show, is impossible. We can't be totally neutral. We reveal ourselves one way or the other. The third response is, I think, that makes more sense, is to learn more. So learn more about, so how do we put together these dimensions of our lives? And we have a lot of learning to do. I'm excited to hear about the new master's program for holistic integration here at the University of Haifa. And that's all about how do we put together these bits and pieces of ourselves that may be fragmented. Well, let me just say, before we move into the reasons why it makes sense to put religion and spirituality together with psychotherapy, just say, usually there's a question people are dying to ask me in this, and it's, well, what do you mean by religion and spirituality? There's a lot of tension in that. And so let me share my perspective, knowing that it's just one, and knowing that we could do the whole talk all morning long about how we define this. It's something that no one agrees on, but let me share some thoughts and approach it in two ways. First of all, I want to recognize that this is very hard to talk about because religion and spirituality are, by definition, undefinable. William James wrote about the ineffability of religion, that you can't put it into words. I came across this cartoon that really captures it for me. And if you can't read it, it's like on the top, well, first of all, you have 3 dinosaurs hanging around. And at the top, and there's a burning object falling out of the sky. And one dinosaur says, hey, everybody, look out. It's one of those, with the fire and stuff. And at the bottom, it says, despite its name, the thesaurus was quite often at a loss for words. That's how it's like. That's somewhat similar to how do we talk about spirituality. We're often at a loss for words. So one way I found useful to think about spirituality is not through a formal definition, but through metaphor and symbol. So let me share one metaphor I have for spirituality. What do you see? Tell me what you see. How many people see the chalice, the cup? Okay, that's pretty easy. What else do you see? Do you see the two faces? Okay, that's pretty easy to see. Now we get a little bit more interesting. What else do you see? Do you see the man, the guitar player, with the sombrero in his face? You see that? Some of you see it. Does some of you have a hard time? Some of you have a hard time seeing it. It takes a little while. His right elbow is his nose, and his guitar, the base of his guitar, is his mustache. So the sombrero is his eyebrow. And what do you see in her face? Yeah, another woman holding her sombrero. Does everyone see that now? Yeah? There's more there. What else do you see? Look at the man's left ear. Do you see anything interesting in the left ear? Yeah, it's the typical woman coming out of the man's left ear picture. This picture is a figure ground illusion, and it actually has multiple figure ground illusions, multiple pictures and images in the background. And there are things in the foreground that come to our attention, then things in the background. And I love this because if I ask you which of these images is the correct one, well, that's a silly question. They're all there, right? They're all there. They're all part of the picture. And the reality is the picture contains both a figure and a ground. And that capacity to see the figure and the ground, that capacity is a metaphor for spirituality. Spirituality is also a capacity to see life more deeply, to see beneath the surface. That beneath the surface of our material life, our superficial lives, there's something deeper going on. There's something deeper beneath the surface. And that ability to see beneath the surface, from the concrete to something deeper, is, I think, a metaphor for spirituality. So I think of spirituality as a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing or perceiving, being able to see or perceive this deeper dimension. And by deeper dimension, I'm talking about being able to see something transcendent, something of ultimate truth, something of timelessness, something of mystery. These are elements of spirituality. And I want to emphasize that, in my view then, with this metaphor, that many aspects of life can be seen with this deeper dimension. The deeper dimension doesn't only include ideas about God or divinity. This deeper dimension can be relevant to virtually anything. One of my former graduate students, Shauna McCarthy, shared this diary excerpt that she wrote when she was a teenager. Now, she's writing about people, but listen to what she is seeing through the sacred lens when she's writing about people. She writes, God has a deep, raspy voice. God is a jazz singer. She's plush, warm, and rosy. God is a grandmother. He has the patient rock of an old man in a porch rocker. He hums and laughs. He marvels at the sky. And my favorite, God coos at babies. She's a new mother. So when she sees people, what does she see? She sees something of divinity. She sees or senses a sacred spark. That's the spiritual capacity that we're talking about here. It can apply, and if we think about spirituality that way, then virtually anyone can do it, including atheists. Atheists can see a deeper dimension. In fact, this next quote comes from an atheist, a woman with cancer who was interviewed in Sweden. And she describes what she sees and feels and experiences when she's in nature. She writes, "Whatever happens in the world for me or others, nature is still there. It keeps going. That's a feeling of security when everything else is chaos. The leaves fall off, new ones appear. Somewhere there's a pulse that keeps going. It's a spiritual feeling if we can use that word without connecting it to God. That's what I feel in nature." So yeah, she connects it with she doesn't connect it to God, but she has the feeling. I would say that she's having spiritual-like experiences. And we can do the same with music, with loving relationships, children, grandchildren. Work can be seen as something of deeper meaning, deeper value. I would suggest that many of us here approach our jobs not as jobs, but as sources of deeper, profound meaning. These are vocations. And so they impact and define the way we live our lives. Now, you could argue that this is just sentimentalizing, and what does this really mean? We're just using the word in a sentimental, romantic way. But this isn't trivial. Whatever we hold sacred tends to become an organizing force, defining our lives, a magnetic force that attracts us, moves us to the future. I told this story earlier, but I want to share it with you too, about a client I worked with many years ago. I'll call her Lisa. She came to my office after she was diagnosed with a glioblastoma. And she was a malignant brain tumor. And she was given 2 years to live. Lisa was Jewish and had 4 children, 4 boys. And I asked how I might be able to help her after, sharing my sorrow for what she's going through. And she said that she had been there for her 3 oldest sons' bar mitzvahs, and her youngest son was 10. And she knew that she was supposed to die, according to the physicians, at 12, and her sons could be bar mitzvahed at 13. She wanted help staying alive. She planned to do all of the treatments, all the chemotherapy, radiation therapy, but she wanted kind of a support to help her through all of this, and I was certainly happy to help her. I talked with her about what she held sacred in her life, and she answered very quickly. She said, my children. And she said, and what I want to live for, my vision, is to be there for my youngest son's bar mitzvah. I saw my older children move into adulthood, and I wanted to be there for my youngest son. And she went through all the treatments and suffered a great deal, but she had a clear vision, a clear purpose in life. And she actually lived almost till her son's high school graduation. Now, I'm sure a lot goes into that, but I certainly think having this larger organizing purpose, a sacred meaning to live for, played an important role in her life. And this brings to mind the words of Nietzsche, who said that he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. So whatever it is that we hold sacred tends to become part of our life journey. It becomes our destination. Whatever we hold sacred tends to become what we shoot for in life, what we strive for. And it also offers pathways for us to how we should live our lives. And of course, there are lots of differences in our spiritual pathways and destinations. Tremendous diversity in that. And one of the major differences is whether you follow a pre-existing pathway. And in the religions, we have pre-existing pathways that have been constructed over centuries, millennia, that people can follow. But people also may prefer to construct their own pathway. And we're seeing more and more of that today in this spirituality of today, where people prefer to construct their own pathway, either partly in and partly out of any religious affiliation, or completely outside of any organized religion. So this leads to my more formal definition. Spirituality is a search for the sacred. meaning it's what we do to try to find something sacred in our life, try to discover it, and once we've discovered it, try to hold on to it and foster a relationship with it over time. And at times we need to transform it because it no longer works for us. So at times we may need to change it. Religion, in contrast, is the search for larger significance in life that occurs within established, pre-existing pathways. But these pathways are designed to facilitate spirituality. So if you think about it, then spirituality can occur inside a religious institution. It can occur outside of it, or partly in, one foot out. In that way, we can think about being spiritual without being religious. That's possible. We can think about being religious without being spiritual. You may be part of a religious institution, and you're not particularly interested in searching for anything sacred. That's not what it's about for you. Or it could be a little bit of both. I do want to point out that at least most surveys today do suggest that most people still call themselves both spiritual and religious. That's not true for mental health professionals. It's another way that we are abnormal. Most mental health professionals call themselves spiritual, not religious. So we, again, don't represent the people that we're seeing. It's something just so important to keep in mind. So with that rather long-winded introduction, let me talk a little bit about why integrating spirituality into therapy makes such good sense. And reason number one, religion and spirituality are cultural facts. They're facts. We don't usually talk about facts in psychology, but they're facts. In the US, as of 2010, 147 million people belong to religious congregations, and with over 335,000 congregations. According to the religious survey in 2008, look at these percentages of people in the US who believe in angels and demons, believe in hell, pray daily. I already told you 96% of Americans believe in God. I asked Panini to share any statistics from Israel, and she was very nice, and she sent this to me to see how well this compares. So in Israel, 42% label themselves secular, but Oprah was telling me yesterday that a good percentage of those who call themselves secular in Israel also believe in God. So go figure. And then we have people in smaller groups of ultra-Orthodox, religious, and traditionals. But the point is that in Israel, religion and spirituality would also to be cultural facts. I mean, it's just part of life here. If they're facts, we can ill afford to ignore them. They're facts, parts of our lives, the lives of our clients. Many people see the world through the sacred lens. Many people pursue spiritual goals. Many people traverse spiritual pathways. And I hope you understand I'm talking about spirituality now in a very broad sense. Not just if you're attending a synagogue or if you're going to a Seder, not if you're participating in various rituals. I would say we've had spiritual experiences already this morning, including the beautiful music that we heard. I think we were transported in this music, and Oprah was translating some of it, and the lyrics sounded like they're very much about transcendence. So for some people, music is the pathway. For some people, nature's the pathway. For some people, loving relationships are the pathway to something beyond themselves. So we're talking about spirituality in a way that's inclusive of both more traditional religious forms and non-traditional forms, but they're all part of our search for the sacred. Another reason why this kind of work makes such good sense. Religion is a resource for many people. A resource, like other resources. In our own work, in the United States, I've been particularly involved in studying how people draw on their faith in times of stress. And we've done many studies of people who are medically ill, people with serious mental illness, soldiers, and so on, and how their faith is involved, for better or worse. And what we find, that is, for many people, their spirituality is the first place they turn to for help. Before they go to family or friends or physicians, they turn to something transcendent. And we find that for many people, this involvement is helpful to them. For instance, there are literally now hundreds of studies, so I'm just presenting a couple to illustrate the point. A study of survivors of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, a devastating hurricane that hit New Orleans. And this study showed that those who had able to turn to more positive religious and spiritual coping resources. So people who were able to find a sense of spiritual connectedness, like Alice, in the midst of the hurricane. People who were able to reframe the meaning of their suffering in a larger, more benevolent spiritual context. People who were able to accept their limitations and to, in some ways, surrender what they couldn't control to some larger benevolent force. These are positive religious coping methods. And people who could do that were at less risk of developing PTSD, became less depressed, and were less likely to abuse alcohol. A colleague of mine, Gail Ironson, recently completed a study of HIV patients in Florida, and they're in the mid-stage of the disease. And she found that these same spiritual coping resources were tied to higher rates of survival over 17 years. She followed them over 17 years. These are just a few examples. But I think they also hold, at least in the research that we have in Israel. Aryeh Lazar and Jeffrey Bork did a study of spiritual support in Israel and found that support from religious leaders, from God, from the religious community, were tied to mental health benefits in various ways. Jeffrey Levin did a study of synagogue involvement in Israel and found that those who attend synagogue are generally less depressed, higher quality of life, and more optimistic in Israel. In the United States, we know that people who attend their congregations regularly, on average, live 7 years longer. For African Americans, it's a 14-year advantage. We haven't been able to replicate that yet in the United States among synagogue attenders, but very powerful kinds of findings that haven't been fully explained yet. So spirituality and religion are resources. Maybe I've been especially interested in the resource of spiritual connectedness and how that facilitates health and well-being, and how we can draw on that in therapy. How do we foster that sense? And I think simply asking some questions in therapy, like, where do you feel most connected to something larger than yourself? It's not a question, you can ask that question to anyone, including atheists. And we can try to support that spiritual sense of connectedness. I'll give you the example with Alice, because once Alice told me her story, I shifted the focus of therapy to how could she begin to cultivate her sense of spirituality so that it wasn't only available to her when she was almost dying. And we talked about that question of where does she feel connected to something larger than herself, and it turned out, even though she never graduated high school, she loved to write poetry. And she said she feels connected when she writes poetry. I said, great, let's start writing some poetry. And she did, and that began to kind of foster her spiritual capacity. That and other spiritual activities she undertook helped her stay out of the hospital, I believe, for the next 10 years. She had been hospitalized on average twice a year for 30 years. In the next 10 years, she was hospitalized only once. I'm still in touch with Alice, and she's now, unfortunately, dealing with a degenerative neurological disorder. But we still occasionally talk, and she sends me poems. She knows I share them with audiences, and she loves to know how the audience responds to her poetry. So I'll probably be telling her I came to Israel and shared a poem, and so I'll share this poem with you and see what you think. I'll share it with Alice. She called this Fireflies, and she writes, "Remember when you were a child in the summertime at night, there were tiny little yellow lights going off and on continuously? I always thought they were flies carrying little lanterns so they could see their way in the darkness. Sometimes the fireflies blend in with the stars. Remember when you feel in the darkness, look around. There's always a flicker of light to give you a glimmer of hope. Think back when you were a child and remember the fly carried his lantern. He found his way. You will too." Pretty good, huh? Yeah. Thank you. I'll share that with her. Another important reason why we need to integrate attention to spirituality in our mental health care, and it's the flip side of the coin. Spirituality can be a resource. It can also be a source of problems. Spirituality, at least the way I've talked about it here, is not inherently good. If we search for the sacred, we have to take a look at what that means. What do we mean by sacred? How are we searching? And sometimes we run into trouble. The example I want to give you is of another case, and this is the story of George. I met George in the waiting room of my office many years ago, and he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was African American, looked to me to be about 70, and I learned he was 60. He was bent over, haggard, deep-set, red-rimmed eyes. He seemed to be staring off in the distance without seeing. And before I could even take him back into my office, he said, "My brother Joe is dead. My brother Joe is dead." He just kept repeating it. And so I said, "Well, why don't you come on back with me to the office so we can talk about your brother Joe?" And he just follows me, repeating to himself, "My brother Joe is dead." And in my office, that's what he said for the first few minutes. "My brother Joe is dead," almost as if that was caught in his throat and he couldn't swallow it. He couldn't digest that reality. So I asked George to tell me a little bit about his brother. And he did. His brother was a deacon in his AME church and had been a wonderful man in his 50s, and he had developed cancer. And Joe had worked with, George had worked with his brother Joe to take care of him as he was dying. I learned more over the course of this visit and subsequent visits that George had been inundated with trauma. Over the last 5 years, he had lost both of his parents. He had nursed both of them in his home. He had lost both of his sons. Both of his sons were killed. And on compounding everything, on the way to his brother Joe's funeral, his sister had a stroke and became paralyzed, half her body. His wife had become suicidal, and George was trying to deal with all this. These weren't George's first experiences of loss and suffering. He was a Vietnam vet, and he told me the story about one time when he was on combat patrol, and they were taking a break outside a village, and they drew straws to see who would get water for the patrol group. He lost. So he carries all the canteens and is walking down to the stream, and while he's walking to the stream, his unit was attacked. They were all killed. He was the only survivor. Now, George was also a deacon in his church, very active member in his church community, and he had taken pride that his sons had never gotten involved in drugs, crime, really wonderful young men. And I asked George, in all of this, what was the most painful part? Because he clearly had multiple sources of suffering. And he said the most painful part for him was why? Why is this happening to me? What is going on in my life? I've lived a good life. I've believed in a loving God. How could this be happening to me? Why hadn't God taken care of my sons? Why had God taken my brother Joe, who is a wonderful man? If this was who God was, then George didn't want any part of him. He just wanted God to leave him alone. Now, George had been traumatized in virtually every way imaginable, psychologically, socially, physically. But what he was telling me was the deepest trauma of all was spiritual. George was suffering from PTSD. He met all the diagnostic criteria, but the clinical diagnosis didn't do justice to his experience. On top of everything else, George was going through a spiritual struggle. And that's really important for us to be sensitive to. When we run into clients who are dealing with depression and anxiety and trauma, they're being impacted not only psychologically, socially, spiritually, and physically, but also spiritually. And for some of them, the spiritual dimension of their struggle may be the most important aspect of their problems to address. And I would suggest that we really can't fully help many of our clients if we don't talk about the spiritual dimension of their suffering. We've been doing research on spiritual struggles and have identified different kinds: struggles with God, interpersonal struggles, struggles between people, conflicts, wars between family members and people, other religious groups, and struggles within oneself, like struggles about failing to live up to one's higher moral standards, or struggles of ultimate meaning, questions about why am I really here and does my life have any purpose? Here's an example of another divine struggle. This came from an undergraduate student of mine, also dealing with bipolar illness, and she writes, "I'm suffering, really suffering. My illness is tearing me down, and I'm angry at God for not rescuing me. I mean, really setting me free from my mental bondage. I've been dealing with these issues for 10 years now, and I'm only 24. I don't know why he keeps lifting me up just to let me come crashing down again." You hear the struggle? She's not abandoning God. She's not becoming an apostate. She's just struggling. She's wrestling. And this has, I think, a lot of significance. These aren't unusual among advanced cancer patients. One study by Tracy Balboni at Harvard found that 58% of advanced cancer patients were in the midst of a struggle. 30% wondered why God allowed their cancer to happen. 29% wondered whether God was abandoning them. 25% felt very angry at God. And 22% felt God was punishing them. That's pretty significant. Hisham Abu Raya in Israel has found that struggles are common among Muslims, and here are just some percentages. 40% feel as though the devil is trying to turn the person away from good. 34% feel punished by God, and so on. Is it true for Israeli Jews? Yeah. Israeli Jews, 30% feel angry at organized religion. 28% are wondering whether there's any ultimate purpose to life and existence. 19% feel troubled by doubts or questions. And by the way, I think these are underestimates. I don't think people often feel free to share their struggles. There's stigma about sharing struggles. I see a lot of clergy in therapy over the years, and they don't talk about their struggles, but once I get to know them, they're struggling. And part of the struggle is the questions they have, and then what they have to present to their congregation. Kind of a struggle-free persona, And then they go home and wonder whether this is just a bunch of, nonsense. These are not trivial at all. We found in one study, national sample in the United States, that spiritual struggles are tied to greater depression, anxiety, less life satisfaction, and less happiness. Among Jews and Muslims in Israel, we find similar findings. Struggles are tied to depression, anxiety. Among Muslims, they're tied to depression and anxiety, less life satisfaction among Jews. We've been able to do this kind of research in virtually every religious group. We also find atheists struggle. Atheists struggle particularly with other people, struggles with believers. Atheists have moral struggles about failing to live up to their own higher principles. And struggles for them are also tied to anxiety and depression. In another study of medically ill elderly patients, we found that higher levels of struggle at baseline were predictive of greater risk of dying 2 years later. I had mentioned that attending religious services can increase life expectancy. Spiritual struggles may decrease life expectancy, particularly if they're unresolved, if you sit with them and they become chronic. Again, this has practical implications. One is to simply ask people we see, how have your problems affected you religiously or spiritually? We ask how problems affect people physically, socially, psychologically, but it makes sense to ask them, so how have they affected you spiritually, which may open the door to conversation about spiritual struggles. And then one of the easiest things we can do is just to listen and normalize, let people know struggles are part of life. They're not pathological. This is not a new diagnostic category. Struggles are part of growth and development. Another reason why spiritually integrated therapy makes good sense. Our clients generally prefer it. I asked Alice why she hadn't talked about her spirituality. She said that people would think she's crazy, and I said, well, if you had somebody who was sensitive to you, would you like it? She says, yeah. And she's not alone. When we survey people from counseling centers, only a small minority say they don't want to talk about spirituality, but they do. Most clients recognize that their mental health professionals' spirituality is a sore point. They recognize our issues, and so they don't talk about it because they don't feel like it's a friendly place for talking about it. But that may have important consequences. This was another study done by Tracy Balboni of another group of patients with advanced cancer, and 72% felt that their spiritual needs were unmet by the medical system. 72%. And she also found interesting that unmet spiritual needs were tied to much greater medical aggressive care, so a lot more end-of-life care. Among minority patients, this was a particularly important and striking effect, that those who felt like their spiritual needs weren't met were more likely to make use of end-of-life care that was quite expensive. Since that time, she's done some work showing that when their spiritual concerns and struggles are addressed, they begin to use end-of-life care at the same level as other people. Another reason why it makes sense to do this work is because, okay, get this, we can't not do it. So you can't really separate out spirituality from our work, even if we try to be neutral and blank slates. And the example I have of that, this is many years ago now, one of my former grad students, Mark Rye, he was interested in comparing he's Christian, he wanted to compare a Christian forgiveness program for couples who are divorced, or individuals who are divorced, to a regular forgiveness program that was not explicitly religious. And being Christian, he thought that a more explicit forgiveness program where people talk about Christ and talk about the importance of turning the other cheek and all of that would be more helpful to people who have been divorced. So we advertised for spouses, ex-spouses, who might want help with forgiveness. And we were worried whether it would get any people to do the study, and it filled up within 2 days. There was no shortage of people who were really pretty disaffected. And ran the study and found that both groups, the secular and the Christian, led to forgiveness. So they seemed to be equally helpful. And, Mark was a little disappointed, and I said, well, let's take a look at that, what might be going on with that. And I suggested we take a look at their comments about the program and how they felt about the program. And did it make any difference to them through comments? When we did that, we learned something really interesting. Among the people in the secular forgiveness program, with no mention of God, spirituality, Jesus Christ, none of that. These were the two of the three most important strategies they talked about for forgiveness were, I asked God for help or support. The other was, I prayed for the person who wronged me. This was the secular group. They had no business bringing up God. We actually went back to the tapes to make sure that the therapists weren't like closet Christians trying to sneak it in, but they weren't. So what's the point? The point was that even though we offered what we called a secular treatment, it wasn't secular because people were adding their own ingredients of spirituality. And you can't, how do you separate that out? I'm going to offer you a secular treatment and don't you dare pray. You can't do that. That's not possible. So what we changed our conclusion completely. And the conclusion wasn't that a secular program and a religious program are equally helpful to people. Our conclusion was that there was no big difference between an explicit religious program and an implicit religious program. They both involved spirituality. So it's very difficult to separate spirituality from treatment. And so what we suggest is just to be more explicit about the role of spirituality in treatment and attend to it in more detail. The last reason why spiritually integrated therapy makes good sense is the evidence suggests that it adds to the power of our treatments. That by addressing it more directly, it actually adds to treatment effectiveness. And here's, I'll give you an example here. This is a study done by Amy Wachholz, and we've done a couple of these versions of the study now, but in this study we worked with 83 college students with headaches that met diagnostic criteria for vascular headaches. And her question was whether or not, she was very interested in meditation and well aware that different types of meditation, mindfulness meditation, mantra-based meditation can be quite helpful to people. But she wanted to know whether or not a meditation that's more explicitly spiritual in nature might be especially helpful. She's very familiar with the writings that say you don't have to be spiritual or religious to meditate. But Amy wondered when you're separating the spirituality out, are you separating out what might be an important ingredient of meditation? So if you put it back in, could you enhance its effects? So she did this pretty elegant experiment where she taught one group of people with headaches to meditate to the mantra, phrases like God is peace, God is love. She taught another group to meditate to a phrase, I'm content, I feel joy, an internal meditative phrase. Then she found we came up with external meditative phrases such as sand is soft and grass is green. And we then added a progressive muscle relaxation condition. And the question was, would these meditative types be equally effective or differentially effective. She believed the spiritual meditation would be the most effective. I was skeptical because I was thinking, well, a mantra is a mantra. Does it make a difference as long as it's okay with the person? But this was her idea. And I'll show you just a couple of her findings. This is frequency of headaches over the course of the study. And take a look at the solid red line. Those are the spiritual meditators, frequency of headaches. All of the meditators had some benefit from meditation, but the spiritual meditators had quite a bit more benefit. Remember, the only difference in the groups is the phrase. They're all meditating the same, except some people are meditating to God is peace. This one's even more striking to me. Here we were looking at how long people could tolerate pain. So the cold pressure task, where we have people stick their hands in ice water for as long as they can. And that's, if you've ever done this, I did it, it really hurts. I mean, it burns. And to keep your hand in it for a long time is supposed to be a measure of pain tolerance. I think it's a measure sometimes of poor judgment that you would listen to somebody telling you to stick your hands in the ice water. But what did we find? Solid red line to spiritual meditators, twice as long. They were able to tolerate pain to a greater extent, which has really important implications, we think, for pain control, possible misuse of analgesics. And in fact, we've replicated the study and found that spiritual meditators do make less use of pain medication. Pretty important. So, which kind of treatment is the most effective? Well, this would suggest that the spiritual meditation may be the most effective. Now, the feedback we got from the journal when we tried to publish this was they said this would be only relevant to people who have some belief in God. And we said, yeah. And so they said, you need to get a sample of atheists to compare this to. And I said, we did this study in Northwest Ohio. You find me 30 atheists. It's not a very, it's a very conservative part of the U.S. Just mention real briefly, here's another example of effectiveness where David Rosmarin did a study of spiritually integrated therapy for worried Jews in New York City and compared a spiritually integrated therapy with progressive muscle relaxation and a waiting list control and found that the spiritually integrated therapy was more effective. The other therapies were helpful too, but the spiritually integrated therapy for worried Jews was even more beneficial. By the way, he did this program completely online. It's an online therapeutic intervention. So let me sum up. I've listed a lot of reasons why spiritually integrated therapy makes good sense. They're empirically based reasons. There's evidence to support each of these points. And now we have some really good resources to help people who are interested in doing this kind of work. These are just a few of the resources that I think are really good for working with Jews. In particular, David Greenberg in Jerusalem has done wonderful work here, and Estelle Frankel. These are all books that are really relevant to Jews. This is a pretty good resource too. I kind of like it. But then a really cutting edge in our field then is developing training. Because again, I think the biggest reasons why more people don't do this, it's not, I think, so much antagonism anymore. It's just we don't know how to do it. And so training like we're doing here and the workshop today is invaluable. And hopefully you'll also continue this and pass it on through other training and supervision, because that's key to the whole process. We developed an 8-module online basic training program for skills in spiritually integrated psychotherapy for all of the mental health professionals who've had no training, just to begin to give them basic skills in the area. And so far the results are looking very promising. The master's degree program here is another example of a training initiative to foster more education. And I think with education, my experience has been that people, at least I've talked to, the therapists really feel it adds an important dimension to their work, and it also makes therapy more exciting for them. Because as they move to the deeper dimension in their clients' lives, it deepens the process of psychotherapy. So let me conclude this way. The key question is not why we should integrate spirituality into psychotherapy now, but how do we do it? And what the heck is taking us so long? In any case, there's no need to whisper. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pargament, for a wonderful and inspiring lecture, as always. We have a few minutes for some questions from the audience.
Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask, how come that in such a talk about spiritually integrated psychotherapy, transpersonal psychology is not mentioned? And I believe that transpersonal psychology is just another way to term spiritual psychology. When Maslow and Veitch and Margolis and Grof sat 50 years ago and decided to start a new path in psychology, it was about integrating spirituality into it. And because spiritual back then seemed like a weird word to use in a professional academic sense, so they decided to call it transpersonal. But it seems that now the word transpersonal is in a way ditching this whole field aside when people are talking about spirituality. So I just wanted to hear, like, how do you situate yourself with transpersonal psychology? Thank you.
I would like to stress then, and thank you for the question about transpersonal psychology and spiritually integrated therapy. Spiritually integrated therapy is not a new approach, and it's not a competitor to any other approaches. When I wrote my book, Spiritually Integrated Therapy, the editor asked me, do I want to call it SIP? So it could be compared then to CBT and RBT and DBT and ACT, ACT, all of the three-letter acronym therapies. And spiritually integrated therapy is instead, I think, an orientation that needs to be integrated with any other treatment orientation. So you don't pick spiritually integrated therapy over psychodynamic, behavioral, whatever you prefer. It needs to be integrated in any mode of treatment. And there are other modes of treatment that are already doing fine spiritually integrated work, and particularly the transpersonal therapists and writers. We can also find humanistic therapists doing wonderful work that certainly speaks well to spiritually integrated therapy. But you're right, they tiptoed around this kind of language because they also wanted to have credibility. And so for many years, we've just tiptoed around it, and the spiritual dimension has been implicit, not explicit. If spiritually integrated therapy adds anything, and if this meeting adds anything, it's again, we're not whispering, we're making it explicit. We've got the S word out there now. So we can say, spiritual, 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 as loud as we want, and it's okay.
Thank you. One last question? Yeah.
We are talking about evidence and about researchers and about spirituality. And it's hard to combine between the two. And my worry is that when you come and train a therapist and you say, these people, they believe in something, so go with them. It will be a split because the therapist, I believe that he has to be connected and really to believe and really to be a part of this thought. And this thought is not an evidence, it's a belief. So I'm asking about the evidence, the therapist, and the belief.
That's a wonderful question, and it gets at the whole issue of, do you need to share the patient's or client's spiritual beliefs and orientation and worldview to be effective? And I would say no. I would say that there are particular challenges in working with clients who come from your world. And in some ways there's some advantages because you may have some knowledge, but I think there are disadvantages too, because there is no such thing as the Christian client. There is no such thing as the Jewish client. There's no such thing as the ultra-Orthodox Jewish client. There's tremendous diversity within every religious group, and I would also say there's no such thing as the atheist client. So if we're coming from the same world, we have to be careful of making the assumption that we truly understand when we don't. With any client, we have to assume the opposite, I'd say, that no, I don't really understand you, at least in any full way, and I need to learn more about you. There are also risks to coming from a different world, and that's in assuming or imposing your own religious or anti-religious orientation on your clients. The solution, in my mind, is getting to know who you're with without as many assumptions, but also recognizing who you are and how your own level of spirituality or non-spirituality, your own background, your own biases and preconceptions and assumptions are likely to affect the relationship. That's part of the challenge in psychotherapy. But I would emphasize that spiritually integrated therapy we don't need to come from the same religious worlds to be effective.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much again.
You're welcome.